For context, I've lived most of my life bouncing between Pennsylvania's Corn Ocean area and the popular mountain tourist destinations to the northeast. Those who have lived or visited those general areas may be aware of the peculiarities of Pennsylvania roads. Firstly, that they are horribly managed, and secondly, these roads see a lot of death. Roadkill is a problem just about anywhere with motorists, but I hardly go a single day without seeing mangled deer carcasses. Most deer here are pretty and well-mannered, which is probably why it's particularly disturbing to see fawns with crushed skulls, or does with their entrails dragged upwards of 10 yards down the highway. However, wildlife gore isn't the specific sort of death I was obsessed with growing up. My thing was looking out the window and finding crosses, markers left for those killed on or near the road, typically from car accidents. There's one not far from me that has the word Jessica written in a bubble font on magenta painted wood. Hers has been there as far back as I can remember. I'm in my early 20s now, but someone still tends to it and occasionally brings flowers and places photos around it. Honestly, I've always found it heartwarming that Jessica is loved, even now. Many crosses I've come to expect on my daily routes have become worn, knocked over, and just generally abandoned. I realize there probably isn't anyone left to take care of them, but it is still sad to know that these crosses that symbolize someone else's loved one are now lost to decay and rot. Disheartening as that is, at least I can mentally distance myself from it. If you pushed it far away, it's easy to pretend that death is not part of living. Although I was rather abruptly forced to acknowledge it a few times in my childhood. Once, on a dark summer night, a family friend was driving me back to my mom's following a long road trip we had taken. It's about a 2-hour ride, and being an annoying 12-year-old, I didn't even try to sleep, which meant I was looking out the window, watching the tree line along the highway. We soon came upon a blocked lane and the flashing lights of an ambulance and police. I watched, sort of shocked, as a person that had a sheet drawn over them was hauled into the back of an ambulance. The adult driving quickly assured me that the man was going to be just fine, and that was the end of the discussion. I'm feeling pretty sure that was my first dead person experience outside of a funeral. Despite the distance and the reassurance of my family friend, there was no obvious gore, and while I do remember seeing a damaged vehicle, it was only a little smashed up on the nose, and alongside the driver's side. Overall, probably not something that should have left a big enough impression on me that I still think about it to this day. And perhaps I wouldn't have, if it didn't happen in combination with my first experience with road hallucinations. It was a good hour down the line after I saw it. I was nearly home to my mom when the road began to shift and undulate. I mentioned it to the driver, who told me I was just tired, and it was a common mirage. To my initial amusement, I began to see figures scrawled out on the surface of the road, like 2D cartoons. I began to describe it to the family friend, the many dragons and sweeping humanoids I was seeing in these dizzying little patterns, laughing and occasionally staring a bit as the visions grew more vivid. The friend driving me told me to stop looking at the road if it was scaring me. I, of course, didn't listen. Suddenly I saw a very pale, translucent figure in front of us about 15 yards away. It was low to the ground and appeared to be a person resting on its belly. I watched as it began to rush towards us. Now, clearly legless but crawling at a breakneck pace with its arms, it jumped on the hood of the car. Its face pocketed with empty sockets, like black voids. I screamed out loud, and then it was gone. I got reprimanded for hollowing and screaming and scaring the driver. I stopped looking at the road and happily walked into my mother's home when we arrived. Even though I told her all about my visit with my dad and my trip, including the weird illusions I saw, telling my mom didn't stop me from plugging an old nightlight in the wall before going to bed and hiding under my blankets. That was also the first and last time I saw such a vivid mirage while in the car or otherwise. It's hard to describe just how very real this event felt to me, even though it happened so quickly. I still can picture its body and face moving towards me on that highway. Rationally, I know it was a trick of the mind. I still love long road trips, especially if I'm not driving and get to watch the scenery. However, I do not try to stare too long at the dark asphalt these days. My husband and I went on a 10-day road trip where we went tent camping through 8 national parks. We didn't necessarily have an encounter, but I wanted to share the story anyway. We were driving from Mesa Verde in Colorado to the Petrified Forest in Arizona. It was a 3 or 4 hour drive. We got a late start after eating dinner. I always start out as the first driver. Then, when I get sleepy, as I typically do, he drives the rest of the way. My goal was to get to Gallup, New Mexico, to grab gas and switch seats. I jumped in the driver's seat after a long day of hiking, and down the winding highway road we went as it got darker and darker outside. This road had too many curves to be considered a highway, in my opinion. Then, every few miles there was a sign to slow down due to road fatalities. Then there are sharp turnoffs leading to different housing areas. This wasn't a road I would have volunteered to drive down in the dark, but here I am. Carefully, I drive down this road in the dark, white-knuckling the steering wheel, prepared for any number of creatures to run out in front of me, since there were very few houses or other buildings along the roadside. I kept hearing dogs barking and growling, even though I didn't think the houses were close enough for me to even be able to hear a dog growl. Even though there was no one else on this road, I felt like I was being watched or something ominous. The curves turned into a straight road. My husband usually sleeps while I drive, but I kept him awake because something just felt odd and very off. A few hours in, I was getting extremely sleepy. My husband offered to drive. I would just have to pull over on the side of the road. I told him it was okay and nervously joked that if we stopped, the car probably wouldn't come back on, or we would end up getting the door knocked on by some black-eyed children. He stayed up and we chatted about how eerie this road felt. 30 minutes later we saw lights and the town of Gallup, New Mexico. I pulled into McDonald's and we got out to stretch and switch seats. That's when we noticed the highway signage. The top marker reads Highway 491. The bottom marker reads formerly Highway 666. After getting gas and getting on the interstate again, I started Googling Highway 666. So many stories popped up. Hellhounds, disappearing hitchhikers, ghost trucks that run you off the road, UFO sightings, time loss, orbs, you name it, it's probably there. Route 666 has an unusually high number of road casualties. Well, it did anyway. Now that it's been renamed, the death toll per year doesn't seem to be as high. The Navajo land skirts the road, and they performed a blessing on it, believing it to be evil. The Native American locals warned travelers about shapeshifters and evil medicine men. Mind you, we didn't know any of this beforehand. We didn't psych ourselves out before driving down the Devil's Highway. We thought it was a normal road at the time. Albeit a bit dangerous, while we didn't have any sightings of anything strange, I'll never forget the feelings of dread and alertness to my surroundings. I shudder to think what could have happened if we had decided to stop on the side of the road to switch seats. A little background on me. I'm a 19-year-old male, and I was traveling with my girlfriend. We were on a road trip to visit my grandparents who lived a couple of states away. They said we could stay at their place for a few weeks over the summer, and it seemed like a no-brainer because they lived on the beach. The path to getting there, though, was long, and it was a painful drive. My girlfriend and I disliked driving, but we figured that we could take turns and it wouldn't be so miserable. I think the total time on the road was roughly about 10 hours or so. We were about 5 hours into the drive when we decided to stop at a rest stop. I'm not going to lie to you. We stopped quite a bit. I'm a little compulsive with drinking water because I like to stay hydrated. As you might imagine, there are some consequences of being hydrated. It did irritate my girlfriend to an extent, but not very much. I think she secretly liked that we were stopping for my sake and not hers, because she always seemed to buy something every time we stopped. This one rest area was not horrible or anything like that. It wasn't in a bad area that I could tell. It seemed like a very typical safe rest stop, but this is where one of the most horrifying experiences of my life took place. At least, the first part of it. This has simply been one of the many times when I pulled off of the road to go pee. When I saw that there was also a McDonald's near this one rest area, I decided to wait until we got there. I normally don't eat McDonald's, but I let myself do it on special occasions like road trips. It makes the drive go by a little better, even if it makes my stomach feel like garbage. So, I went to the bathroom and she bought some more cigarettes. We had already made our way to the McDonald's when we had our first appearance with this creepy guy. We did talk to him a little bit. Let's call him Joe. He was the strangest looking man I've ever laid my eyes on. He looked like he didn't come from this country or anything like that. And not on a racial basis or anything, he just looked like he had a completely different lifestyle. As if he lived off the land and had never used electricity a day in his life. His beard went all the way down to his stomach, and if you looked at it for long enough, you could see food particles in there. And some of them, not even from a meal that he had eaten today, probably from days before. So that should give you a good idea of his level of cleanliness. The rest of his outfit followed suit. A dark pair of jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in a decade, and a large leather jacket that looks like the oldest thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm sure it wasn't that old, but it had a timely appearance due to it being in such poor condition. Anyway, we spoke to Joe because he awkwardly sat next to us at McDonald's. I thought this was extremely strange, and it weirded me out. I am an introvert by nature. Talking to people is extremely taxing. My girlfriend is an extrovert and always attracted people that were interested in the conversation. I just found it strange because I never had someone randomly sit at the same table as me. Like, this was kind of very out of my comfort zone. I figured that it was because of my girlfriend attracting talkers, but looking back, it was probably because we appeared to be easy targets. Joe sat down next to my girlfriend and started asking us what we were doing and where we were going. My girlfriend, being the optimistic and unsuspecting person that she is, gave him the entire story, that we were basically 5 hours away from anyone that we knew in any given direction. I tried to give her a look that she needed to shut up, but she didn't get the hint. We had already ordered our food and were sitting down and eating. He didn't order anything. He just invited himself to our table and talked to us for the entire time. At first he was rather polite, but had a thick accent that didn't seem like it belonged anywhere that I knew of. I couldn't tell you where the accent came from because I've never heard anything like it in my entire life. And this is coming from someone who knows plenty of people from the North, Midwest, the South, Australia, and anywhere else in the world. This accent just didn't seem like it came from Earth. After a painful experience of trying to get away from Joe, we got back in our car and started on the journey again. As we got to our car, I also noticed that Joe had gotten into his car as well. As we had pulled out, Joe was a good distance away from us. I thought this was extremely strange, and the warning signs in my head went from flashing to high alert. I knew that we were in danger. I was driving and I tried putting the pedal to the metal. The next half hour or so, I had probably gone faster than I ever have in my entire life. I was normally a safe driver, but this guy was really freaking me out. I tried telling my girlfriend that this guy was tailing us, but she genuinely didn't believe me. She thought I was just being paranoid. But what are the odds of seeing this guy at the gas station, and then him being behind us for 30 minutes after we get on the road? She told me to pull over at the next rest stop, and we would know for sure if he was trying to do us harm. Stupidly, that's exactly what I did, and my worst suspicion came true. He pulls off at the same rest stop, and parked right next to us. My adrenaline was rushing as I got ready to fight this guy. I didn't know what else to do. I told my girlfriend to call the police, and then I got out of the car. He was easily a foot taller than me, but he was a little older and probably not in the best shape. I could probably take him if I had to. I also had the benefit of being an athlete at my college. I did all the intramural sports stuff like that, so I was in decent shape. But none of that mattered when Joe pulled out a knife. There was an immediate understanding between the two of us at that moment. The understanding that he was out to do us harm, and I was going to have to fight him. I waited for him to approach. About 30 seconds went by, and he started walking in my direction. My heart was pounding. I started screaming every insult that I could. I called him a degenerate and an old man who was in way over his head, that I was going to whip his ass. It didn't scare him, though. When he got within 15 feet of me, I thought it would be a good idea to tackle him. I was going to try to just take him by surprise, you know? But I didn't. I tried getting him off of his feet and onto the floor, but when I tackled him, he plunged his knife right into my back. That was the only good hit he got on me, though. I managed to get him on the floor, and after that I started kicking his head ferociously. I didn't know how I managed to do it, but he was on the ground seemingly unconscious, and I was just standing there. I could feel the blood flowing down my back, and I got into the back seat of my car and yelled at my girlfriend to drive me to the nearest hospital. I was questioned a few days later at the hospital, but I don't think anything really happened of it. I guess the police showed up after we had left and found Joe still there unconscious. He was in a coma, and the police didn't know what to think. Once they got mine and my girlfriend's version of the story, they seemed to believe it, and I think the gas station cameras corroborated that. So, that was that. I don't know when or if Joe will ever wake up from the coma, and honestly, after he almost killed me, I kind of hope he dies. That was an extremely traumatic experience for me and my girlfriend. The good news about the situation is that I can tell people that I put someone in a coma once, and if they don't listen to me, they're next. This story happened to my dad and his wife. He was driving in the middle of nowhere in Utah, I believe. He and his wife wanted to make a stop at a gas station to get some snacks, use the bathroom, etc. When he got to the gas station, he saw a police car parked out in the lot. When they walked into the gas station, he saw a man at the register. My dad saw that the man was listening to a police radio. My dad didn't really think anything of it at the time, and he asked the man if they needed a key to the bathroom or if it was unlocked. The man looked anxious and uncomfortable. The man told my dad that he didn't think that he needed one, so my dad walked to the bathroom. Right before he went in, he saw a doorway with a curtain in front of it next to the bathroom door. My dad looked at the end of the curtain and saw that there was what he thought to be men's feet and what he believes to be police officer shoes. My dad tried to stay calm, so he walked into the bathroom and just stood there contemplating what to do. He got himself to calm down. Then he walked out calmly of the bathroom and went to his wife and calmly said, "Hey babe, let's go home. I'm pretty tired." My dad just wanted to make sure this guy couldn't do something to them if something ended up happening. She looked confused, but then understood what he was trying to do, so they paid for the gas and left. What my dad thinks happened is that guy killed the police officer and took his police radio to make sure no one was trying to contact the police. But while he was hiding the body, my dad and his wife drove into the lot, so he pretends to be the cashier. I asked my dad why he never called the police, and he said that if he did, the guy at the gas station would hear the dispatcher, and he would go after my dad. They were on a road trip and had a huge trailer, and that guy could easily catch them, I guess. I don't know. That's the logic he had at the time. My family likes to take long road trips from time to time. There are 7 of us in total, so we usually take my family's 2005 Chevy Suburban. It was getting old, but could still normally handle long trips easily as my dad is a master mechanic and kept it well maintained. However, this trip was different. My dad had recently fixed a truck for some friends for the family, who had recently moved away to Billings, Montana, while we were in eastern Iowa. My parents decided that we could take the friend's truck over to them and make a vacation out of it. So we loaded the friend's truck onto a car trailer and we piled into the Suburban and hit the road. As we neared the northern border of Iowa, my dad came to the realization that the trailer brakes had stopped working. I heard him talking to my mom about how we could probably make it just fine with the brakes on the Suburban. Both couldn't shake a feeling that they had felt like something was going to go wrong. Almost like a premonition, you know? We already have a heavily loaded up Suburban, a car trailer with a pickup truck on it, and a riding lawnmower, and some other parts in the back of the pickup truck. If we had to slow down or stop, it could be quite hard. Then my dad remembered a friend of his who ran a truck repair shop nearby and gave him a call. His friend quickly agreed to help him repair the trailer brakes. So after an hour and a half of waiting around in this tiny town, we were back on the road again. As we continued north, we noticed dozens of motorcyclists everywhere. That's when we realized we were heading through South Dakota. At the same time, we were going through Sturgis. For anyone who doesn't know, Sturgis is a huge motorcycle rally town, basically in South Dakota. Now, my dad quickly begins to get a little tense as we don't really have anything against bikers, but due to the sheer amount of them and the large vehicle and trailer combo that we are driving, it was going to be a challenge to stop if they needed to bob and weave between us, you know? After some time, we finally make it to the hotel that we had booked that night. Now, my mom had really wanted us to visit Mount Rushmore for obvious reasons. It was along the route, and we wouldn't have to make too much of a detour. As we were getting closer to Mount Rushmore, I noticed more and more mountains, and even more bikers as we continued to push onwards. We finally made it to Mount Rushmore, and as soon as we had hit the suburban parking area, my dad immediately gets out of the car and sits down and starts shaking his head in his hands. My dad is not easily shaken at all. Seeing him in this condition really surprised me. I had to ask him what was wrong, when my mom grabs my arm and pulls me away and leads all my brothers away to some public restrooms. A little while later, my dad joins us at a bookstore and had mostly calmed down. I then hear my dad say something, and I think he was mentioning why he was so shaken up. It turns out we had nearly killed over a dozen bikers at the bottom of a long, steep hill. We were trying to make our way down the hill, and my dad realized that there was a large group of bikers at the bottom of the hill, all stopping at a red light, which had to be the worst placed intersection I have ever seen. When my dad saw it, he stomped on the car's brakes, and to his horror, they failed. He then locked the trailer brakes, and then somehow, by the will of God, it brought us to a stop. He's not sure how they managed to do it, but thank God that they did. He knew for certain that if we had not fixed the trailer brakes, we would have certainly crushed all those bikers, and they would have had no idea that they were going to meet their fate that day. Last month, my mom and dad decided to fill up on food and gasoline so we could drive up to Montana for a road trip to visit my friends and family over there. My family, my aunt in specific, we'll call her Dolly, owns a good piece of property in the Montana countryside. Her two sons, Clint and Coulter, live on the property with her, so we get the chance to meet them for the very first time. After a few days of driving north, we arrived at their house at about 6 a.m. Clint and Coulter are in their 20s, so they aren't much older than me. We hit it off as I had known them most of my entire life but never actually met them in person. The six of us spent the day shooting guns, riding horses, throwing axes, and learning how to rope cattle. In case you couldn't already tell, Clint and Coulter are cowboys, but nothing out of the ordinary happened in that day. The scary part is what happened late that night. It was about 9 p.m. After a long day, we all sat by a bonfire. We made and cooked small steaks and corn on the cob. After we ate, I got my guitar, Clint got his harmonica, and Coulter got his fiddle. Or violin, as most other people know it as. Anyway, we started playing our instruments and having a great time. Soon enough, my mom, dad, and Aunt Dolly began to dance. A couple of her hounds around the fire started hopping around and joining us. The oldest of the four just started wagging his tail. We had fun for about 5 to 10 minutes until we heard a loud, disturbing noise. The land around this area is flat, and there were little to no trees, so it's easy to see stuff in the distance, but it's pitch black outside other than the brightness from our fire. Whatever this was, it sounded like a cross between a yell from a man and a gunshot, and maybe even the cry of a buffalo. We all went pale, but Clint was the first to get up, draw his revolver from his side, and aim it in the direction we heard the yell come from. "Run to the house and grab the rifles," Clint told me in a deep voice. Thankfully, my dad had a .38 special with him, so he could cover me on my way to the house. I ran for about 15 feet and tripped. Coulter ran over to help me up. When I looked up, the moonlight shone on something far in the distance. It looked to be about 7 foot tall, skinny with long hair. It looked like it had horns or something. The shock of what I saw had made me nearly pass out. I would have fallen over like a dead man if Coulter did not hold me up. He set me down close to the fire. Clint got on one knee before me and asked, "Are you all right?" I answered back saying, I saw something." No one asked what I saw, but I'm pretty sure it was a skinwalker. I asked Coulter the following day if he saw it too, and he said no. No one else even remembered the loud yell. It's almost as if their minds were wiped. I'm starting to think it was all just a dream. But if it was a dream, why do I have a scraped up knee? My boyfriend Kai and I decided to go on a weekend road trip, and we also wanted to bring my boyfriend's Doberman Colt along with us. We took my dad's Ford F-150, which he let me use. Seeing as I was the only one who drove it, I put on the truck bed cover to protect our stuff. We packed enough food and supplies to last the weekend and set out. The first night went great. We ate dinner, swam in the river, fooled around a bit, and left after breakfast the next morning. Later that day, we were listening to music and joking, and half looking for places we could pitch our tent for the night. About 2 hours after we left that small town we stayed in the day before, we found a place we could stay. I pulled in as the sun was setting, and we went outside and got our stuff while Colt looked around. He was always protective and cautious of strangers, so we let him do his thing. Suddenly, he started growling. Kai and I looked over to the direction Colt was barking and saw a man appear from the clearing. Colt began growling aggressively, and Kai had to hold him by the collar. This man looked to be about in his mid-40s, and not really built, but kind of lanky, perhaps around 6'3". My boyfriend is also 6'3" and in incredible shape. He hits the gym religiously as soon as he can. I'm 5'9" and have an athletic build, but by no means do I look strong. The man seemed to notice we were younger because he dropped his creeper face and smiled wide.
"What are you two kids doing out here?"
He spoke. His voice was gravelly and sounded like he had routinely smoked since he was 12 years old, and he didn't even acknowledge Colt, even though he was barking and starting to foam at the mouth. My boyfriend spoke up before I could say anything. "We just decided to come hang out and get out of the way, you know?" The man chuckled a bit and looked over at me.
"That pretty little thing your sister?"
I stood there like a statue and said, "No, I'm his girlfriend." The man nodded slowly and answered,
"Ah, that makes sense. Well, don't get too out of hand,"
he said before winking and walking into the woods again. I looked over at Kai and looked back at the woods. "What the heck was that?" he asked me. I just shrugged and kind of tried to shake that feeling of fear off my shoulders before we went back to setting up camp. After a while, we lit a fire and started snacking on some chips. I started thinking about the man and instinctively looked back to where he had disappeared into the woods. I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing, which for some reason scared me. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not there. Suddenly, Colt, lying between Kai and me, sat up, and the fur in his neck stood up. He looked over the fire and into the woods directly across from us. Kai slowly grabbed a large pocket knife from his hip, which I didn't know he had before, but in hindsight I'm very glad he did. He gestured for me to get into the tent and slowly followed me, not taking his eyes from the woods. I whispered to him, "Do you think it's just a coyote or something?" He shrugged. "I don't know, but Colt doesn't alert for nothing. There's something in the tree line." He was cut off by Colt snarling. I thought he was aggressive before, but this was a whole nother level. I didn't even think dogs could get to this level. Kai practically laid over me to shield me from whatever this dog was growling at. Suddenly, Colt's aggressive snarls turned to cries and whimpers, and he ran into the tent and ran behind us. This freaked me out, and I started crying hysterically. Kai signaled for me to keep quiet, which was when we noticed there were footsteps outside of the tent. Kai lightly pushed me to the back of the tent, hunched over, and made his way to the front. He went to peek out, and I kicked his ankle. He looked at me confused, and I shook my head. We suddenly heard a familiar voice, and my blood turned to ice.
"Hey, I just wanted to let you know, your fire's still lit, not very safe."
Kai cleared his throat, still holding the knife, and walked out of the tent. "Thanks, we were gonna put it out soon." I could hear the fake confidence in his voice.
"Be careful out here, son. Some creep would kill a young man like you. Pretty things like that girl. Say, where is she?
Kai lied. Oh, she went to bed a few minutes ago. The man let out a disappointed sigh, and he said,
Well then, good night.
and I heard footsteps go off back into the woods. Kai came into the tent and said, forget the tent, get Colt, and get in the truck. I didn't question it. I just got up, grabbed Colt's collar, and I kept crying as we got into the truck, hopped in, and started it up. And when we took off, only then, about 30 minutes later, did I even remotely feel at all safe again. Kai finally decided to tell me the man had a gun in his front pocket and did a lousy job of hiding it. We continued moving down a country road at about maybe 20 miles per hour, and suddenly a large coyote walked out in front of us. We slammed on the brakes and it ran off. Any regular night I would have just continued driving, but after everything that happened I just sat there and started crying again. Kai unbuckled the seatbelt and wrapped his arms around me. Even though this might not sound scary to some, this experience horrified me. The feeling of helplessness scared me. The thought of that man using the gun on Kai frightened me. The idea that my dad would have no idea of knowing what happened to us scared me. An actual human is way scarier than any cryptid or anything supernatural because humans are real and can cause real danger. Stay safe out there. Around 3 years ago, my high school class went on a hiking field trip. It would be a 3-night trip. Luckily, in my class, I had my friend Jonas and my girlfriend Ashley and my brother David. We were super excited about the class trip because we had never been on an overnight road trip in school before. It was 2 days before the trip. I was hanging out at break with Jonas. We were talking about what was going to happen on the trip. I'm super pumped for this, dude, Jonas said. Let's hope we don't get eaten by a mountain lion, I joked. Funny joke, man. Way to ruin the trip for me, Jonas said. Don't worry, Jonas, you won't get eaten since you have no meat on your bones, I joked. Oh, shut it, Luke. It's not like you have any meat either, he responded. That's when David joined us. Sup, guys, where's Ashley? He asked. She's talking to her friends right now, I answered. Then the bell rang. Well, I'll see you guys later. The day of the trip had finally come. When we all piled on the bus, all 4 of us were lucky to get in the back seats together. Ashley and I were on the left, and Jonas and David were on the right. We were riding the typical school bus that picks you up in the morning, the big old yellow thing. Look at the lovebirds sitting aside from each other, Jonas said. Shut up, Jonas, Ashley said. I don't get how you can stand those two, she said. Oh, trust me, I can't, I replied. The bus ride was about 5 hours long. Half the kids were already asleep by the time we were halfway there. When we finally reached the mountains, we stepped out of the bus and couldn't believe our eyes. It was such a beautiful sight. High mountains, with dark green leaves all over the trees surrounding it. You can hear rivers and creeks flowing and birds chirping. It looked like a paradise. Our teacher told us to come on when we got done taking in the sights because we had to meet up with the guide. As we made our way to the ranger station to pick up the map, I couldn't help but notice this eerie feeling that I had. Felt like someone was watching us. Hey, speed it up, man, Jonas shouted. Okay, Mr. Impatient, I responded. Our guide was already waiting for us when we got to the ranger station. Good morning, folks. My name is Jones, and I will be your guide for the next 3 days. Jones told us everything. He handed us all a map and spoke. Anyone who needs to use the restroom before we go, it's going to be about 3 miles before we make it to our campsite, needs to go now. After everyone stopped using the restroom, we started making our way to the campsite. Alright kids, don't forget this is a science field trip. That means we will be learning about wildlife here, Mrs. Fink said. I was excited to learn about the wildlife here since I liked animals. Not many other people shared my exact thought though. I'm excited to see the waterfall when we get there, Ashley said. Me too. Hopefully Jonas might fall in, I spoke, and we both laughed. I heard that. I'm not deaf, you know, Jonas responded. Oh, my bad. I thought you were blind, David said. Shut up, David, Jonas said. About 1.5 miles into our hike, I got that same feeling again. It felt like we were being watched. You okay, Luke? David asked. Yeah, you've been acting strange since we got here, Ashley said. I'm not too sure, guys. It feels strange out here, like we are all being watched or something, I answered. Looks like the mountain lion will get you after all, Jonas joked. We continued the entire time. It felt like we were being watched, and one time, I could have swore I saw something peeking at me from behind a tree. When our class eventually made it to the campsite, it was about 3 p.m., so it was still bright outside. There were about 15 kids, and we only brought 5 tents, so 3 kids would have to sleep in one tent. The teacher and the guide brought their own. I had to share a tent with Jonas and David, and Ashley got her 2 friends Kylie and Whitney. When we finished setting up our tents, the tour guide said we would go to the waterfall since it was still bright. The waterfall was about a mile away from our campsite. Ashley and her friends were excited to go. David, Jonas, and our friend Michael weren't all stoked. We were the only guys on the trip. When we made it to the waterfall, it was just as you expected. Water falling off a cliff. Not that exciting. While looking at the waterfall, I thought I got a small glimpse of what I could tell to be a head peeking out from beside a rock. "Hey guys, did you see that?" I asked. "See what?" they said. "Something is peeking out from that rock," I answered. "Bro, what are you talking about?" Michael asked. "Don't worry about him, Michael. He's been acting strange the entire time we've been here," David said. "I swear I saw something, guys," I said. "Stop trying to scare us. Like, it's getting old," Jonas said. "I'm not trying to scare you guys. I saw something peeking out from behind that rock," I spoke. "Give him a break, guys," Ashley said. "Did you see it, Ashley?" I asked. "No, I didn't, Luke. It could have just been your eyes playing tricks on you. After all, it is close to sunset," she said. "Maybe you're right, Ashley," I said. "Once we get back to camp and eat, you should be fine." Michael then interrupted. When we returned to camp, I still couldn't get over what I saw and how nobody believed me. When I started thinking, I thought about the story Richard told me, about how he and Jerry were attacked by a creature a while back. Sadly, they weren't on this trip. They snuck out of Jerry's house to Ding Dong Ditch when he kept seeing a black figure the entire time follow them. Eventually, when they made their way back, they smelt something horrible. They went to check it out, and it turned out to be some sort of creature. They were then attacked, but they somehow made it home safely. When he told the story, I thought he was lying, but I was beginning to believe it was true while out here. We weren't near northern Alabama anymore, so I was just thinking I saw things or was hallucinating. When we got back to camp, our guide asked us if the 4 of us wanted to volunteer to do some firewood scouting, to collect firewood. Me, Michael, David, and Jonas volunteered to do it. The guide showed us where to look and told us not to go too far away from the campsite. We made our way from the camp and into the woods. We split up to look when we got to where the guide told us to go. While I was looking, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, but I got no response. I ignored it and kept looking for firewood. While looking, I heard more footsteps, and they were closer now. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I shouted. Truthfully, I was starting to get freaked out at this point. I turned around when suddenly, "Boo!" Jonas shouted, and I freaked out. "You should have seen the look on your face," David said. "You were freaked out," Michael joined in. "That wasn't funny, guys," I said. "It was," David responded. "How about we finish getting the firewood?" I said. "Fine, but you must admit that was pretty funny," Michael asked. "Okay, yeah, it was a little funny," I responded. "See, I told you." "All right, let's get back to the camp now," Jonas insisted. When we got back to the camp, we gave the firewood to our guide, and he made a campfire for us. We ate dinner, and after that we made s'mores. It was pretty good, not going to lie. After that, we had a scary story contest. I won when we finished doing all of that. It was time for us to finally go to sleep. While in the tent with Jonas and David, I had to use the restroom. I got out of the tent and went a little way down the trail. When I was done, I started to make my way back up the course again. I heard footsteps once more. "Ha ha, very funny, guys. That's getting old. Come on now," I spoke. I got no response, though. Must have been a deer or something, I thought to myself. I started making my way back up the trail when I heard even more footsteps, this time louder than before. A stench began to fill the air. It smelled like a dead animal. I turned around and saw a silhouette in the dark. I freaked out and started running as fast as humanly possible. I heard it coming up behind me. It was quick, swift. It let out a roar resembling a deer and a lion mixed together. I was almost to camp when the creature stopped following me. I quickly got into my tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. Jonas and David asked me what had happened. I was shaking and stuttering my words. Something chased me to the camp," I said. "It was probably a mountain lion or something," Jonas said. "No, it was tall and stood on 2 legs," I responded, "and it let out a roar resembling like a deer and a lion," I said. You were probably tired and hallucinating, David said. Maybe you're right, I responded. We can talk about this in the morning. When morning came, we were the first group to wake up. We decided to go down to the place where I saw the thing. While looking around, Jonas found a track that looked like a deer's track. See, I told you were hallucinating, David said. I swear I saw something though, I said. Yeah, you saw something alright. A deer, Jonas joked. Funny, Jonas, I spoke. Anyways, let's head back to camp before everyone else wakes up, I said. When we got back to the camp, everyone else was still asleep. We decided to go ahead and make breakfast for everyone. When everyone woke up, they were met with eggs and bacon. The teacher and the guide thanked us, and when everyone was finished, the tour guide told us what we were going to do that day. There would be 3 groups of 5 people, and each group would have one team leader. Their groups would go out into the woods and write down all the wildlife that they saw. For example, if one of us sees a mushroom, we tell the team leader to write down brown mushroom. If someone sees a mouse, then obviously we'd write down that we saw a mouse. The group with the most written down gets double dessert that night. So, for the groups, me, Ashley, Jonas, David, and Michael, and the group leader for us was David, the guide showed us the area we had to stay on in the map, and everyone was in a team. Then, once it's noon, everyone needs to head back to the camp. Our team was already off to a good start, so we had like 15 things written down within just a few minutes. It was about 11 a.m. when we ran into another group. We said our hellos and continued. At this time, we had about 30 things written down, so I had forgotten entirely about what happened the night before. While we were still looking for stuff to write on our list, I got that strange feeling again, but this time much more intense. Like it was all around me. That's when I heard Ashley scream. The creature was standing under a small oak tree about 30 yards from our position. I couldn't see it that well, though. We started running away from that thing as fast as we could. We ran off the trail trying to lose it, which was a terrible idea. When we eventually stopped to catch our breath, it was nowhere to be seen. I think we lost it, guys, Michael said. What was that thing? Ashley asked. That's the thing I saw last night, I answered. You went outside last night without telling anybody? You could have gotten hurt, and nobody would have known, Ashley exclaimed. Now's not the time for that. We are lost and something is hunting us, David said. How will we get back to camp if we don't have a map? Ashley asked. We must find the trail. It should lead us back to the camp, Jonas said. I remember which way we ran, Michael exclaimed. Would you like to lead the way then? I asked. Yeah, Michael said. When we started following Michael, we kept our eyes and ears open and tried to make as little noise as possible. It's way too quiet out here. I don't hear a single bird, Jonas said. For once I agree with you, Jonas, Ashley mentioned. Guys, shut up, we're making too much noise, David said. We are still following Michael at this point. It was probably only 1 p.m. before we found the trail. We need to hurry and get back to camp before we get in trouble, Michael said. Are you sure this is the right trail? I asked. Yes, Luke, I'm sure. There's a slight problem, though. I don't know what part of the trail we are on, Michael said. Oh, isn't that just great? We're lost, Jonas mentioned once more. Listen, everyone needs to calm down, okay? We need to find a sign or something, that's all. It gives us all the directions we will need, David said. Well, which way should we go then? I say we head down the trail, so we don't get too deep into the woods, I said. All right, let's go then, Jonas mentioned. There was a faint breathing noise. We all started shaking at this point. Then we heard footsteps, loud footsteps. It sounded as if someone was dropping sledgehammers on the ground. That's when we listened to the lion, deer-like roar once more. We started running like bats out of hell. It was right behind us and we could smell that horrible smell. We could hear its footsteps as it got closer and closer and closer. We didn't know where we were going. That's when I tripped on a tree root. I screamed for help and David came back to pick me up, but the creature hit him down. Jonas came and threw a stick at it. I was able to get up and help David up. Michael shined a flashlight at it and it let out this god-awful roar again. I was able to get a good look at it this time. This thing was 8 feet tall and had a deer skull for its head. It was skinny to the point that it looked like a skeleton. It hit Michael with its forearm. I screamed for Ashley to run. When I did that, it grabbed me and tried to bite at me. David was able to throw a rock at it, which caused it to let out another roar and distract it. It scratched David and ran away. David, are you okay? I asked. Yeah, I'm fine, he responded. We need to find Ashley. She ran that way, Jonas yelled. While walking down the trail, we found a fire watch tower. We walked up the stairs and knocked on the door and were greeted by a ranger who let us inside. What happened to you, kiddos? Why are you guys out here so late? He asked. We're on a school trip, and yesterday we were doing an activity and got lost. We also got attacked by a bear," Michael said. "So you guys are the kids we should be looking out for," he said. "I will contact your guide and tell her we found you," he said. "Can you also ask them if they found Ashley?" I asked. When we met with our class, our teacher and guide hugged us and asked if we were all right. Ashley ended up running into them eventually, petrified. We soon left that day, never to return. About a month later, a group of college students went camping and went missing. I'm pretty sure I know what happened to them. If you're ever up on a hiking trip and feel like something is watching you, keep an eye out because you might not be alone. I was on a big West Coast road trip back in the winter of 2021 when I met a long-haul truck driver who told me this story, so I would tell it from his perspective. I had been on the road for about a week when I pulled into a rest stop service station outside of Bakersfield, California. It was already dark out, so I pulled in and tried to get some shut-eye. I checked my phone for a minute before climbing back in the cab when I heard someone knocking on the window. Now, certain forms of solicitation are relatively common at these truck stops, so when I saw a woman standing next to my truck, I figured it was just another lot lizard looking for a payday. I rolled the window down very slightly and told her to buzz off. When she stuck her fingers in the opening between the window and the door, I realized something was wrong with this woman. No, this was no run-of-the-mill lady of the night. Her proportions were all off. Her arms were far too long, her head far too small. The fact that she was able to stick her hand in the window meant that she was at least 10 feet tall. As if you've ever stood next to a semi-truck, you would know they're a good ways off the ground. I quickly rolled my window up as she withdrew her hand. I looked down at the woman. She lifted her head to meet my gaze. That's when I noticed her eyes. Her eyes were jet black. No pupils, no iris, nothing. Just two dark pools for infinite blackness. My breath was caught, and I suddenly felt like a deer in the headlights. I felt a fear I had never felt before. It was primal, it was instinctual, and if I weren't so plugged up from the road, I probably would have voided my bowels right then and there. Her hand was still pressed against the window, and I saw her nails were long and jagged.
"Hey, baby,"
she said.
"You looking for a good time?"
Please, ma'am, step away from the vehicle, I said.
"Oh, come on, baby. Just let me in. I promise I'll be gentle."
I cranked the key in the ignition and threw it in drive, punching the gas, and I swear, when I looked back in the side view mirror, this lady was transforming into a giant freaking spider, and I could still see those eyes. Those eyes that will haunt my dreams. Those eyes, they looked so hungry. Adolescent Dogman Sighting by Philip. When I was about 12 years old, I was on my bi-yearly visit to see my grandparents, both of whom I loved dearly and wished to spend more time with. They lived in upstate New York. The specific area has since been developed, but it used to be just a few houses between islands of woods. There also used to be a lot of farmland interspersed between those woods. The wildlife around there usually included deer, black bears, porcupines, and everything in between, all of which I was accustomed to seeing on a weekly basis there, none of which I could confuse with what I saw that day. Me and my cousins were all there. We were playing in an old willow tree which we transformed into a makeshift treehouse. On the event day, we all played while waiting on the Thanksgiving dinner. We had a pair of binoculars to look a bit further to observe intruders that would dare intrude into our willow tree fort. The older ones of us didn't take it very seriously. We were all just having fun being kids. Nevertheless, we were all playing lookout, ensuring there were no intruders, doing our part. That's when I saw something I wasn't seriously looking for. It was only about 4 foot tall, but definitely had a humanoid form. Honestly, I didn't believe what I was seeing quite at first. I thought maybe it was my imagination. So before I told anyone, I asked for the binoculars, expecting to see a group of leaves or some sort of tree limb. And when I looked, I saw something that I guess I could only say was some sort of werewolf, dogman, corgi man, were-corgi? But instead, as I peered through the binoculars and trained my eye on a better view of what I was looking at, it was less than 25 feet from our position. Anyway, I saw fur, muscles, and a gently moving chest that expanded and contracted with each breath, as well as predatory teeth extending from its open mouth. Still, I didn't really believe what I was seeing. I thought I was letting fear take over. So I asked my oldest cousin what he saw. He confirmed what I saw, and we told our younger cousins not to move and to stay calm. We didn't tell them what we saw at first. We were afraid that they would freak out and run for it. So we all sat there not moving. After my cousin hung the binoculars up on a hook, it was staring at us. It was almost like it felt like an hour, but it couldn't have been more than just 20 or 30 minutes. The sun began to lower in the sky. Finally, our silent vigil was broken by the sound of my grandmother calling, "Boys, time for dinner," at which we all sat there wondering if we should make a run for it or not. So we all decided if we would go, now would be that time. Not because of dinner, but because there was an adult out here, and indeed if there was a time to make a break for it, now was the time. So I announced, "Alright everyone, run for the front porch." We all made it inside, and my cousin, who also saw it, was also so disturbed he didn't really eat much. After Thanksgiving, we were all safe. My grandmother, much to our fear, asked where are my binoculars. Only then did we realize how scared we were because we left them out there and we all refused to go back out. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was some sort of fear-driven imagination, or if I saw some sort of adolescent dogman. Face to Face with Dogman by Anonymous.
My name is Evan, and I live in a pretty rural area of Maryland. My life is pretty crazy and full of insane and scary stories, many that I hope to tell on this channel. I have always wanted to be a park ranger. I'm very into nature, and I love fishing and traditional bow hunting. I also have a very indoor side, and I love to play video games with my friends. Anyway, this story takes place in a large patch of woods near a rather big creek in the summer of 2019. The woods are not too far from my house, so me and my brother would often go there to trap minnows and crawfish, and just play around. For some reason, I felt really off about going to the creek when my brother asked if I wanted to go. You know when you get this gut instinct that something just isn't right, even if you have no clue what it is? That's the feeling I was having at that very moment. I brushed it off and said yes nonetheless, and so I packed my leather travel bag with my micro fishing pole, our house keys, 2 crawfish traps, and my trusty fixed blade knife, bug spray, and some hand wipes to keep the nasty muck off our fingers. I hesitated for a moment before leaving my room. Something told me I need to grab my longbow. My longbow cost me a fortune and is all handmade. It actually could probably take a tumble more than any of the modern bows I own due to the durability of the wood and the great craftsmanship. I didn't want to bring it at first, but that weird gut feeling that something was off won over, and I grabbed the bow, just in case. Besides, it was made for the woods. My brother noticed when I came outside that I had my bow with me. He asked if I needed any broadhead arrows. I said don't worry, I was just doing some practice. I think he was a bit scared, and I felt bad. I love my brother to death, and only want the best for him, so seeing that he was nervous, I said that I would make sure to be careful, and I offered to let him shoot it. This seemed to cheer him up a bit, so we headed up the dirt path to the edge of the woods. It wasn't a long walk. You could always see the forest and hear the noises all around you. This was normally a comforting sound, but halfway to the spot where we'd entered the woods, my brother noticed how silent the woods have gone. When he said this, I realized he was right. There was not a single sound from anything. Dead silence all the way through the forest. My gut feeling was starting to be confirmed, and my brother started to look very nervous. My bow was slung over my shoulder, and this gave me some comfort knowing I was armed. My brother then asked me how many arrows I brought. He again sounded excited about the proposition of shooting my longbow. I took this bit of enthusiasm and told him I had a perfect spot to shoot and set up the crawfish traps. As we entered the woods, somehow it seemed even more silent. I, of course, had no perfect spot and was just doing this to keep my brother from flipping out. We eventually did find the creek, and I told my brother to set up the traps. I gave him the crawfish traps and a little raw chicken I had packed, and he set off. I, however, took this opportunity to look around the area. It was rather dense foliage on all sides of the creek bank, and no sign that anyone else had been here for a very long time. I heard my brother splashing in the creek, probably scaring the crawfish away. Suddenly, a noise to my left snapped my attention away from the creek. It sounded like a massive branch had been snapped in two. I looked in the general area of the sound and noticed there was nothing there. At this point, I was getting very scared, and so I pulled out an arrow and knocked it on the string of my bow. The woods seemed weirdly dark, as if it was already 6 at night, but it was only 12:30 in the afternoon on a warm, sunny summer day. I began to shake and was about to call out to my brother when I saw it. At first, it looked like a massive, black and brown mass that blocked out the sun, but then I realized it was fur. I was staring at what looked like to be a dog or a wolf standing on 2 feet looking at me. I was instantly terrified and didn't want to move. It's as if the eyes were hypnotic. Its eyes were bright green. Even from 9 feet away, I could make out every feature of the creature. It was easily 6'10", and had a snout with teeth dripping with drool. Its mouth was partially open, and so I could see its large tongue covered in drool, as if it wanted me for its next meal, which it probably did. It was covered in dense brown fur which seemed to be extremely thick and matted. It had claws, but its paws were more like human hands than paws that a normal dog would have. Its ears were perked as if it were listening to my heart beating. I started sweating and decided to throw caution to the wind and shoot. I go to full draw and let the arrow fly. A direct hit on the beast's chest. Although it looked as if the broadhead had not even made a slight impact, the tip of the arrow was stuck in the creature's chest. But it didn't look like any other penetration happened. The creature looked more pissed off than hurt, as if my arrow in its chest was a slight inconvenience. I knew that the arrow would have gone completely through. I'm used to hunting big game, and this bow had some serious draw weight to it. I stood frozen once more as the beast grabbed my arrow and pulled it out of its chest. It tossed it aside as if it was unimportant. The weirdest thing was the blood. It was the darkest color I have ever seen. It looked like tar compared to the normal red coloration of what we know to be blood. I still don't know if it was my eyes playing tricks on me, or if the blood was really that strange color. As I stood in fear, my brother yelled that he had found a strange pile of bones in a small cave near the creek on the other side. My heart sunk to my stomach as I realized this beast was for real, and if I didn't get out of there, me and my brother were going to be that next pile of bones. I yelled for my brother to grab my bag and we'd leave traps and come back for them later. He yelled up if everything was okay, and I said yeah, but my friend wanted to know if he wanted to sleep over at his place, and he was going to come pick us up. Excited, my brother grabbed the bag and ran up the hill. I was so focused on the conversation that my eyes had drifted away from the beast standing across from me. When I looked up, it was nowhere to be seen. We booked it out of the woods, all the while I could hear foliage being stepped on to my left. We made it out of the woods in minutes, in record time. I texted my friend Omar to see if I could come over. He said of course and asked if I was alright. I said yes, but I'd explain later. He picked us up at a local gas station. My brother said he had a headache from running so much and wanted to go home. Omar drove him home and I said goodbye. As soon as my brother hopped out, I jumped right into what had happened. Omar didn't laugh like I thought he would. He looked at me when I finished telling him the story, and he told me that his father had the same exact experience 13 years ago. I was in shock but relieved he believed my story. We picked up some burgers and went home to his place. That night while watching a movie, we researched what those things could possibly be. It turns out there's a creature called Dogman. While further digging on YouTube, I found your channel. I decided to share my experience here to hopefully get some answers. Thank you, Swamp Dweller, for sharing my story. Also, I never went back to get those crawfish traps.
My hunting trip was spoiled by Jimothy.
Back sometime in 2008, I was on a hunting trip with my brother up near the Canadian-Michigan border. We had rented a cabin for the week, and were looking forward to a nice, quiet week until this monster spoiled it all. One night, after a day of being in the woods, we were tired and didn't feel like cooking us a meal, so I decided to jump in my truck, drive into town, and pick up some pop and some grub, while my brother stayed back to wash up. So I drove down into town by myself, and was about 45 minutes away. For about 45 minutes max, probably not even a solid hour. I talked with the gal at the counter for a few, but I wanted to get back to feed my brother since he gets grouchy when he doesn't have food, and I didn't want him hacking at me. By the time I headed back, it was getting dark, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already gone down all the way. I hit the road leading to the cabin and could see the silhouette of something big looking in one of the windows of the cabin. At first I thought it was my brother, since it looked like it was standing on two legs, but this thing looked to be way too tall to be my brother. So then I thought to myself, well, maybe it's a bear. I didn't want a bear coming around the cabin and causing trouble, so I decided to try to scare it off with my headlights. So I aimed my truck in his direction and flipped on my high beams. What I saw was not a bear. It was a monster. When my lights hit it, it spun around and I saw the whole thing, and it was only standing on two legs. Now, my description of this thing is terrifying. I wish I had my camera handy so I could have just took a picture and give it to you, but I wasn't expecting to see any type of monster out here. He was a big guy, like Harry from Harry and the Hendersons, but it wasn't any Sasquatch I was looking at. It looked more like a werewolf. He was more than 7 feet tall at least, based on how high his head was above the top of the window. He was brown, like a chocolate lab color, but the coat was different. It was shaggy, like a wolf, and had like lighter spots on his chest and legs. He had big muscles like he worked out in a gym all day. His chest was pretty wide and his shoulders looked to be that of Brock Lesnar. This thing was a real juice head. This thing had arms that looked like it could kill you very easily, and these long, fingered hands with big nails at the ends. His neck was as thick as my waist almost. Even with all that power in his body, that's not what scared the heck out of me. Honestly, it was his face. He looked like he was madder than hell about something. Maybe because I interrupted him. Maybe that's just what their attitude is. But those eyes, they will haunt me for the rest of my days. I believe in good and evil. This thing was pure evil. The light reflected off its eyes like a night predator, and the rest of his face looked just like a wolf. Snout, teeth, nose, ears, all of it was just like a wolf. When this thing spun around to face me, it pivoted on its two back legs and turned like a human would. First, he turned his waist to look at me, and then pivoted to face me entirely. My body went numb and I started to shake. What in the heck was this thing? A werewolf? The only thing I could think that this thing was trying to do was to get to my brother, and he didn't have an idea that this thing was out here. So I started honking my horn and flashing my lights to try to get it to go away. Then, that thing put its hands up to cover its eyes, just like a person. It gnashed its teeth at me and then ran off into the woods. It was still on two legs the entire time. I pulled right up to the cabin as close as I could, grabbed my mag light, and took off into the door. I left the truck running, and I was calling out to my brother like a crazed man. He ran into the living room yelling at me, asking what the heck I was doing. I told him something was out there and we had to leave. Luckily, my brother is a trusting man. 43 years of living with me, he should know when I'm serious, right? So we grabbed our rifles and mag lights and took off to the truck with haste. As we ran to the truck, we could both hear something big running in the woods next to the cabin, and the loudest growl I had ever heard. That growl almost shook my insides. We tossed the guns into the truck and jumped in. My brother was shining his light into the forest, but he didn't see anything. Then we took off out of there like a bat out of hell. On my way back into town, I told my brother what I had seen, and he just shook his head. I think he was letting it soak. He just looked at me and said, "I think we saw ourselves a werewolf." I looked up at the sky. It wasn't a full moon, so I don't know what I saw that night. We went back during the day a few days later after going to church, and I might add praying a lot. We got our stuff and talked to some gentleman that rented us the cabin and told us what I saw. He swore he had never heard of anything like that around there before, but I kinda felt like he was lying. This is exactly why I'll never go into the woods alone, or unarmed, ever again.
Dogman on the Highway by Dr. Null. It was a rainy night in early December 2022. I was out shopping for Christmas decor. I was just about done shopping and ready to start going home. I had just started my truck up, turned on my headlights, and started going down the road when I illuminated a silhouette of a furry thing. It was dark, and my headlights only showed so far into the pitch-black night. The shape seemed to run. It got on all fours and ran into the forest, the black, and whatever else. I was frozen in fear and shock. In TV shows and movies, you see this all the time, and I didn't think it was real until it happened to me. I never got why they would do that or why you just didn't run for the monster, but now I do. I get it. It must have been half an hour before I started to drive again when I got on the road. I eventually floored it. I am usually a safe driver, but not that night. I went like my life was on the line. Little did I know that when I peered into the forest beside me, for literally just a half a second, I saw a pair of beaming reddish-orange eyes. I drove faster and faster, then realized that if I went home, this thing could potentially follow me, and I was not about to lead this thing to my place of rest. So I drove into a 24/7 diner. I was going to wait a few hours and make sure it would lose interest and move on. So I ordered a coffee and some eggs, but I must confess I only picked at them. I was in no mood to eat. I was wondering if my little plan would work, if I was right about what that cryptid was. This thing was brilliant, and I didn't think it would mind waiting a few hours to eat me. So I stayed till dawn, honestly. It was about 6:30 when I finally left that diner. When I got to my truck, there was this horrible scent of urine coming from my car, and on one side there was deep gash marks, and even one of the tires were popped. I had no clue how my truck's alarm didn't go off. I thought this thing marked my truck with its urine, and that if I drove, it would follow. So I called the tow and got my buddy to give me a lift home. It was calm after that. My truck is still in the shop and I'm okay, but this thing scared the absolute crap out of me, and I'm pretty sure it was a Dogman. The Red-Eyed Werewolf by Mr. B. Hello there, Swamp Dweller. You can call me Mr. B. I have heard the majority of your stories told on the channel. I want to say I love your narrations. Now then, I wanted to tell you of a time I came face to face what I could only describe to be as a Dogman. For context, I'm a 26-year-old male, 5'6", and kind of buff. Never scared easy. Coming to think of it, standing face to face with this thing, I got an otherworldly presence. Anyways, I'm getting out of mind here. As I was saying, this all took place at my good friend Jason's house in Mount Poconos. Now, Jay's place was not too shabby. It wasn't exactly what you would think of for a home up there. It was very modern. Jason loved to drink. So, as we would do every other weekend, we would get smashed and have a good time. Okay, now for the story. I was gearing up to go out ice fishing with Jason late at night, drinking and having some fun doing nothing but staying warm with these pocket warmers. So it wasn't all bad. I arrived at Jay's place a little after 5 as we would be drinking shots before we went. But something deep down was telling me not to drink so much that night. I don't know if it was a weird feeling you get when your body can sense something isn't right while you physically can't, so I chose the latter and kind of drank here and there. Jason asked why I wasn't drinking as much, but I said not to sour the mood. Sorry man, just got terrible pains in my stomach. Jason replies, well, alcohol heals all. I laughed and said, nah man, I gotta go to the bathroom. He said, forget you then, obviously starting to get drunk already. So I head to the bathroom. I feel this overwhelming sense that something just isn't right. For further background, I have a family of occult witchcraft. I was blessed by my grandmother's sister right before she passed. This haunts me to think about, but I'm living strong. As I am standing there, this window looks out into the forest, and a dense forest surrounds it. I take a look, and in the distance, I see what can only be described as glowing blood-red eyes. I take a step back and leave the bathroom immediately. I get to my friend, who was already ready to go, and I saw that he was drunk as a skunk. Having a backpack of 12 cans of Busch, his bottle of vodka, you can say he was definitely a bit tipsy. He looked at me and said, hey, you ready, or will you be a sissy and chicken out? I gave him this look like, don't go. But I said, no man, I'm good. I'll come with. He's my friend. I won't abandon him there if something is lurking about. So I gear up, but I take a simple sawed-off that he keeps under his kitchen sink with some slugs. I take them and load them up. Jay asked, hey man, what are you doing with my baby? I said, well, I thought it would be fun to shoot some cans when we're done. He of course goes, hell yeah man, let's do it. I dump half the shells in my bag and get up and head out. It was a crisp, cold night. We headed out to find some ponds. Yeah, sounds dumb, I know, but this is my friend. He was there for me when nobody else was, like a brother. I also brought spray paint with me, pure white to mark our paths so we wouldn't be lost. Now then, we are going deep into the woods, and it is so dead quiet that you could hear the drop of a waterfall from a mile away. It wasn't right. It was off. I couldn't help shaking it off. We are being watched by a dark, solid force. There was a presence. I looked around as my friend slowly stumbles and falls. I go to him, pick him up, and say, I think we should head back. You're too drunk. Let's party in the house, man. He looks up, smiles drunkenly, and says, sure, I want to listen to AC/DC. It's too cold. Besides, we're probably out of beer as well, he says in his drunken state. So I slowly picked him up and we started walking back very slowly. We turn around and I see it there, standing behind us not even 50 feet away. This thing was tall. If I had to guess, it was roughly 10 feet tall or maybe even bigger. This creature was just standing there before me and my friend. Sounds began to emanate from this thing, just breathing, and the steam coming from its nose, with those same blood-red eyes I saw before. It didn't do anything but stare at me, but I knew that this thing was much more hostile if it wanted to be. I was trying to understand what it wanted, and it seemed like it was trying to understand what we wanted. Or maybe it was deciding to attack us, or if it was going to let us go. Now I know that not many would take this as accurate and brush it off as a rubbish dogman encounter story. But to me, being from my family, it was more than understanding that we were not so different. I had my curse and it had its curse to bear. Mine is to be doomed to loneliness, as my friend Jason died 6 months after this. To end this story, the beast then closed its eyes, and just like that, it was gone in the darkness of the trees. We scrambled and made it back to safety. My friend literally peed himself, and I didn't know what to say or believe what we had seen that night. This again was 6 months before his death. In the end, as I say, my curse is loneliness. Well, that is true. I have no friends, but I work. Not much family left, that's for sure. And it isn't enjoyable nowadays about having anyone be your friend, as I am also an empath. Honestly, this was a life-changing encounter with what I can only describe as Dogman, and I would love to know what others would think about this. And thank you, Swamp Dweller, for sharing my story.
Something Stalks Our Land by Anonymous.
7 years ago, my wife and I purchased a property in 11 acres of woods in a rural part of the northeastern Minnesota area. The woods were connected to a more significant acreage of fields and woods of about 160 acres, and although sparsely populated, the land is near a fairly busy state highway. There are some housing developments in the area, but they are about 3 to 4 miles away, and the majority of the land all around our property is farm, fields, woods, and rivers. It's incredibly remote, but I wouldn't call it wild with towns so close. I'm mentioning this because I've heard of many Native American legends of things in the deep northern woods of Minnesota and Canada, but the area we live in is not that. Rural, yes, but not the endless north woods. As I said earlier, I'm not a believer in the supernatural, and I've never been afraid of the woods or the outdoors. Even though I have a healthy sense of caution and respect for giant bears, moose, wolves, or other potentially dangerous wildlife. I am also an avid hunter and mountaineer, and have experienced many nights in the wilderness. I've had numerous encounters with dangerous animals or situations, so I'm not entirely spooked too easily. Knowing my state of mind is essential to my story because people can explain so-called supernatural encounters with an already high level of belief, anxiety, or fear, but that's not me. Well, that all changed after the first few weeks of moving in. The house and land had been abandoned for a couple of years due to foreclosure. So much work was needed to be done to get it back into shape. Wildlife had grown accustomed to no human presence, and black bears frequently roamed the yard at night, and many other woodland creatures also found this to be some sort of highway. We also found many animal bones scattered throughout the woods and an abundance of coyotes. One night during those first few weeks we had a rainstorm, and I was worried about a broken downspout potentially causing a basement leak. It was about 10 p.m. so I grabbed my headlamp and headed outside to deal with it. Behind our house is a relatively large, swampy area that divides the woods. I had my back facing this area while fiddling with the downspout when suddenly I had this intense feeling of dread. It's tough to explain the surface, but my body knew something was back there. It wasn't a normal feeling of observation. I had never felt this type of fear before. I tried to stay calm and slowly turned around to point my headlamp back towards the swamp. What I saw was something I still can't explain. Eyes. Numerous glowing, reflecting eyes are staring back at me. These were not the eye reflections of what you would see with deer or other animal, since they were different heights. And when I pointed my headlamp right where you would expect these things to be, there would be nothing but weeds and trees. When I turned the headlamp off, they were still there and glowing as if they were right there with a light being shined on them. They did not move. They just stared through me. I bolted and ran as fast as I could back into the house and explained it away as a deer or some sort of raccoon. Later that summer, I sat on our screened-in porch that partially faces the swamp and connected the woods to the east. It was approximately 11 p.m., and when I heard what sounds like a bear fighting or some sort of thing attacking a cow, since there was a small farm to the southwest of my property, I assumed that perhaps a cow wandered off into the woods and was being attacked by a bear. I didn't know if this was something that a bear would do, but it was my only guess based on the sounds I was hearing at the time. It was some sort of roar like a bear, but then followed by a frantic-sounding cow's mooing. This went on for over an hour, and it was perhaps one of the most horrifying sounds I've ever heard. It did not frighten me since I had this rational explanation, but even weirder, this same series of sounds happened again over the following summer. I never investigated the area of the woods these sounds came from because it was not my property. A couple of years later, I had the chance to purchase this area and 70 acres to the west, which consisted of the woods connected to mine and a few tilled fields and more lumber and ponds. As part of purchasing this land, I spent a lot of time walking around it to understand its value and layout. As part of my walk, I was able to get a much better look at the farm setup to the south. As I suspected, the farm did have cows, but the area they were kept in was a long distance away from my house, much too far for me to be able to hear them. The fencing was also exceptionally well built and electrified. There was no way a cow would just wander out from that farm. I didn't think about this until recently, but it's best to lay everything out in chronological order. After obtaining the property, I put up tree stands at various locations and trail cameras to prep for the upcoming deer hunting season. One spot was the hilly woods where I heard those sounds many years prior. Again, I did not connect these two things until now. The area was very odd, as whenever I hiked through there, I always saw some new strange thing. One time my son and I found an old game snare tied to a tree that looked like it had been dried with blood. Another time, we saw at least a 100-year-old tree with a barbed wire fence completely spiraling the entire trunk, growing in and out of the different intervals. I've also found many tree trunks with substantial scratches or claw marks not resembling an antler rub or any sort of bear, but maybe it's just a giant bear, who knows. We'd almost always find dead animal bones in this area, and even this winter I found a couple of deer legs snapped and picked clean. My sons have found numerous animal skulls out there as well. As I was saying, I put a game camera in this area since I had seen tracks and signs and wanted to get a sense of the best place to hunt. I've tried one there many seasons, and unlike my other cameras, I've never captured anything on it. Nothing. Not a single thing. My son has posted there a couple of times for hunting season, as mentioned a strange sense of quiet. He used to think the forest sounds were just lacking in this area. Maybe there weren't many bugs or something. But he would note that they would sometimes come alive again randomly and be just as loud as everywhere else, as if something were coming and going. He has mentioned hearing something walking around in the past as well. A couple of years ago, my son went out hiking in the woods to try to find me since I was out doing some forest management. As he walked through this area, he thought he spotted me coming through the woods fast, but quickly noticed that the walk and clothing were nothing like mine. He said this quote-unquote person he saw did not notice him and seemed to be walking in a straight line, like they had tunnel vision or something. Seeing someone in this part of the woods in their travel direction doesn't make any sense, since there would be no reason for them to even be doing this, especially since the way they were going only leads to deep ravines and an uncrossable river. After he found me and explained what he saw, I quickly investigated whether he was a trespasser or if it was something else. I hiked for quite a while, but I never found anything or anyone. They either got picked up on the road or vanished. That same year, my son had a friend over, and they went for a late afternoon walk in the woods. As it began to get dark, they made their way back by walking on the edge of the field next to the area of woods. They saw a figure a little ways off in the trees as they passed by. Whatever they saw was near one of the hills in this patch of forest and seemed to be making some hand gestures. It began strolling towards them. When they called out, "Hey, hello?" he or it stopped and said nothing. At this point, the boys sensed something was wrong, and they bolted back toward the house. They rushed into the house and told me what they saw, and I of course laughed it off as their minds playing tricks on them. My son described the figure as being very tall, like 10 to 15 feet, but with skinny arms. Its body was dark with hair all over. They even thought it was an animal because of its odd appearance. It even seemingly had German Shepherd type ears. It was gaunt and skinny and strangely long. Being the curious and protective father I am, I was worried about it being a trespasser, a drug addict, or something even worse. So I told them I would take a look. They brought me to the area and pointed to where it was standing, and I headed into the woods. Since it was winter and there was snow on the ground, I thought it would be easy to locate the tracks of whatever this thing was and find out where it came from and where it went to. There wasn't a single track or disturbance in the snow when I got to that spot though. There was no way an animal or a man could have been in that area and left no traces. They had either made it up or their minds really had played tricks on them. Or so I thought. My son and his friend still swear they saw it, clear as day, and I can attest that their fright was real. My wife has also experienced strange thrashing sounds and other feelings of dread or being watched in this part of the woods, and generally refuses to go there anymore. All of this brings me to today, where I suddenly realized that all of these strange sounds, sightings, bones, and events seem to be centered around this one area, and I'm just at a complete loss of what it all means. It's all too strange to bring this up and discuss it with people I know around here, but I wanted to see if my story would resonate with anyone here in the swamp. I'll continue to investigate on my end, but I would love to know what you all think. After doing some internet research, it does sound very similar to a dog man, but there are also some strange circumstances that don't quite match up.
Something large watched our camp. By Anonymous.
Growing up, I had a childhood friend that lived relatively close by, and we were like two peas in a pod. We were both very adventurous, believed in the paranormal, enjoyed astronomy, and generally just being outside. She was born in Alaska and her dad lived there for quite a while, so they were always into camping, hiking, fishing, skiing, you name it. I got introduced to fishing with my friend's family, and did a lot of camping with them. This happened during the mid to late 90s, and we were about 10 to 12 years old at the time. It's been a while, so I can't remember exactly. On one camping trip, we went to this lake in the forest surrounded by a meadow, and feeding the lake was a small stream leading out of the woods. Anyway, we played in the field and stream all day while my friend's dad fished. The lake wasn't too big, because it had a huge meadow all around it. He could keep an eye on our whereabouts while he fished. While messing around by the stream, the wooded area it was coming from gave me a weird vibe. I couldn't explain it. I just felt uneasy. Anyway, the day faded into early evening, and it was time to leave and find a camping spot. My friend's dad packed up his fishing gear and we walked back to the truck on this long, winding path through the woods. Once in the car, we drove into a more remote area of the forest and made our way to the steep road that was so rough and inclined that I was convinced that my friend's dad would break his truck. He had a 4, maybe 6-cylinder Toyota pickup that was about as basic as a truck could get. I'm not even sure if the truck had 4-wheel drive, but I trusted him because he was an avid Alaskan outdoorsman with years of experience. We finally made it up to the top, which was flat and relatively open with a significant forest area in the opposite direction from the road we drove up. We pitched our tents, got everything set up, and my friend and I decided to explore the area. We were maybe 50 yards away from the tents when we heard a big crack as a tree branch snapped in the woods behind us. We got quiet and looked in the direction but did not see anything. Thinking it was just a deer, we brushed it off. As we walked more, we heard it again and whispered about what it could be, but we kept on going. It stopped briefly, and when we were about 200 yards from camp, we sat on a boulder looking down the steep, wooded hill overlooking the dirt road from where we had come. Suddenly, we heard another cracking branch from behind. Whatever it was seemed to be following us. Our imaginations were going wild. We came up with everything from a serial killer stalking us in the woods to Bigfoot. When we got back to the campsite, we told her dad what we had heard and how it seemed to be paralleling us. He played it off as a black bear and secured all the food. Later on, my friend confided in me that her dad had gotten out his pistol and would be sleeping with that all night. My friend and I were sharing one tent, and he was in his tent not far from us, so we figured everything should be okay. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night, I'm not sure what time it was, to hear something or someone walking outside. I could listen to it quietly circling the tent as I lay there listening. It sounded like it was walking on 2 legs because it had a distinct rhythm to how it walked. That said, it sounded big. It sounded like it had clear weight to it, if that makes any sense. As it put each foot down and walked, I could even hear relatively quiet but deep, heavy breathing at times. As I listened intently, I could hear it wandering to other parts of the campsite, then back to our tent, almost as if it were walking in a big repetitive loop. For who knows how long. It felt like an eternity to me. Terrified and unable to wake my friend, I listened until I eventually fell asleep. The following day, I told my friend and her dad about it, but I don't think they believed me. Interestingly enough, absolutely nothing in the camp was disturbed in any way. The ground was not very soft and covered in grass in some places, so footprints weren't very legible, but there were some clear, giant, wolf-looking prints. I always wondered what walked around our tent that night. After hearing many stories from the swamp dweller, I think it might have been some sort of dog man.